During the worst snowstorm to hit the Midwest in over 2 decades, 12 strangers found themselves stranded on a desolate highway, their cars buried under layers of relentless snow. With phones dead and no help in sight, the freezing wind howled like a warning. Hope was vanishing, until a faint light flickered in the distance. It was a small diner, seemingly forgotten by time, run by a middle-aged woman named Linda Carter. She had no staff, no backup, and no reason to open her doors that day. But she did. One by one, she pulled those strangers from the cold and into the warmth of her modest kitchen. She didn't ask who they were, where they came from, or why they were traveling. All she saw were people in need, and she acted. For 48 hours, Linda turned her tiny kitchen into a lifeline: hot soup, spare blankets, and quiet reassurance. But things weren't easy. Supplies were running low. One elderly man collapsed from hypothermia. A young mother cried silently while trying to soothe her infant with nothing but water and worn-out formula. And when a fallen power line set part of the nearby woods on fire, Linda braved the storm herself to alert emergency crews on foot, risking her life while others slept inside. She never once asked for thanks. She just kept going. And when the storm cleared and the rescue crews finally arrived, those 12 strangers didn't just walk away warmed and fed, they walked away changed. The storm came out of nowhere. What started as a few drifting snowflakes quickly turned into a furious whiteout that swallowed everything in its path. It was as if the sky had opened up, releasing its full wrath on the world below. By dusk, the highway had become unrecognizable, buried beneath a thick, icy blanket. The wind howled like a wounded animal, shaking the frames of every vehicle still trapped on Interstate 47. Engines sputtered and died. Batteries froze. Cell signals vanished. And inside those motionless cars, fear took root. Families huddled together, clinging to coats and blankets as they watched the temperature fall. A young mother rocked her crying infant in the back seat, whispering lullabies through chattering teeth. An elderly man stared blankly through the windshield, his breath fogging the glass as he clenched the steering wheel, praying someone would come. And Ethan, a college student returning home for the holidays, pounded his frozen fists against the dashboard, trying to will the heat back to life. But it was useless. They were trapped, isolated, and slowly losing hope. With no rescue in sight and the snowstorm growing worse by the hour, despair began to creep in. The kind that sinks deep into your bones, whispering that no one is coming. That this might be the end. And then, through the white blur of falling snow, headlights appeared. A figure emerged. A woman, bundled in layers but moving with purpose, trudged through the storm like it couldn't touch her. No one knew her name, or where she had come from. But in that moment, she was hope. And without a word, she began knocking on the frost-bitten windows, offering something no one else had, a chance to survive. The house stretched out before them, a looming figure in the dead of night, its silhouette jagged against the bleak, frozen landscape. The roof sagged under the weight of neglect, its shingles curling like the brittle pages of an ancient book left forgotten for years. The windows were empty, dark, as if even the glass had long ago lost the will to reflect the world outside. The faint moonlight only accentuated its decay, casting an eerie, unnatural glow over the structure. Ethan couldn't help but feel a shiver crawl down his spine. Something about this place felt wrong in a way that no amount of logic could explain. His boots crunched sharply against the snow as he walked, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. His breath came out in sharp, visible bursts, vaporizing instantly in the cold, stinging his lungs. Every part of him ached, his body was stiff from the relentless journey, his muscles burning from the hours of trudging through the wilderness. Yet it wasn't the cold or the exhaustion that gnawed at him the most, it was the sense of dread creeping into his chest. Beside him, Tessa stumbled slightly, her face pale, dark circles under her eyes betraying the toll this ordeal had taken on her. Jack was moving slower now, his limp more pronounced, his movements stiff as he tried to hide his pain. Despite the exhaustion, they pressed on, driven by the single hope that the house, this house, would provide them with the refuge they so desperately needed. But Ethan's instincts told him this was no ordinary shelter. Something in the air felt thick, heavy, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for them to step inside. And then there was her. She was already several steps ahead of them, walking with a measured, almost unnatural calmness. There was something about the way she moved that unsettled him. She seemed untouched by the cold, her pace unwavering, her eyes fixed ahead as though she were blind to the harshness of their surroundings. She didn't falter, didn't hesitate. It was as if she belonged here, like she had always known this was where they were meant to end up. She didn't even turn back to check if they were following. She didn't need to. She knew they would. Ethan felt a twinge of unease. There was something chilling about her indifference to their struggles, to their need for help. It wasn't kindness she offered, it was something else, something that felt colder, harder. As they entered the house, the heat hit them like a wall, but it wasn't the kind of warmth that made you feel safe. It was thick and oppressive, the air heavy with the scent of mildew, damp wood, and something else Ethan couldn't place, something metallic that turned his stomach. His feet sank into the creaky floorboards, each step amplified in the silence, each sound echoing in the hollow, cavernous rooms. He glanced around, his gaze drawn to the darkened corners, the shadows clinging to the walls like secrets. It was as though the house itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them. He barely registered Tessa's soft, strained voice. "Thank you," she said, but it was more of a reflex than real gratitude. Her tone lacked the conviction of someone who felt safe. Ethan mirrored her expression, his voice quiet and raspy as he added, "You saved us." But the woman didn't acknowledge them right away. She didn't even pause, her movements fluid, as though she were already a part of the house itself. When she finally did turn, it was slow, deliberate, her gaze sharp and unsettling. Her eyes, pale and cold, met Ethan's, and for a moment, he saw something in them, a kind of emptiness that made him question her true intentions. "No one saves anyone," she said, her voice low and cutting through the silence like a knife. The words were sharp, devoid of warmth. "We just do what we have to." Ethan felt a sudden chill despite the oppressive heat. Her words hung in the air, heavier than the stale atmosphere surrounding them. There was no comfort in what she said, no reassurance. She wasn't offering them salvation. No, she was offering them a choice. Or perhaps, she was revealing that they had never really had a choice at all. The silence stretched long between them, suffocating. Then, without another word, she turned and continued down the hallway, her figure swallowed by the darkness that seemed to thicken around her, wrapping her in its shadows. Ethan's gaze lingered on her retreating form, unease stirring in his gut. He glanced at Jack and Tessa, but neither of them spoke, their faces taut with a mixture of exhaustion and confusion. A moment later, a sudden burst of firelight illuminated the far end of the room, flames crackling in the fireplace, snapping and popping with unnatural intensity. The warmth that radiated from it was jarring, overwhelming, yet it did nothing to ease the unease coiling in Ethan's chest. It should have been a welcoming gesture, should have been the thing that made him breathe easier, but instead, it felt like a trap closing around them. The house wasn't offering them comfort, it was preparing to make them part of its own story, one they hadn't asked to be a part of. The crackling fire cast eerie shadows on the walls, its warm light dancing in contrast with the deep, unnatural stillness of the room. Ethan's eyes darted around, a nervous energy radiating from him, but he couldn't place why. The room was claustrophobic, despite its size, as if the walls themselves were closing in. There were old, worn bookshelves lined with dusty tomes that hadn't been touched in decades, their contents left to molder quietly in forgotten corners. The smell of aged paper and something else, something vaguely unsettling, permeated the air. The dim glow of the fire seemed to flicker, almost in rhythm with Ethan's racing heart. His hand clenched into a fist by his side, nails digging into his palm as he tried to steady his thoughts. Every time he looked around, he felt like something, or someone, was watching him from the corners of his vision. There was a heavy weight in the air, as though the house itself was alive, aware of his every movement. It wasn't the kind of place you felt safe in, no matter how welcoming the fire or the worn-out armchairs might seem. It was a place of secrets, and those secrets were thick and suffocating. He couldn't escape the feeling that something was about to happen. Tessa sat on the couch, her body slightly hunched as if the weight of the room was bearing down on her. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, fingers twitching nervously. Ethan noticed her gaze flickering towards the hallway every few seconds, her eyes wide, as if expecting something, or someone, to appear. But she didn't say anything, didn't voice the anxiety she was clearly feeling. Instead, she just stared into the fire, her face pale under the soft glow of the flames. The silence between them was unbearable, each second stretching longer than the last. She was trying to hold herself together, but Ethan could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her breath hitched every now and then. Jack, too, looked exhausted, his normally confident posture slouched as though every step he had taken since entering the house had drained him. He hadn't said much, but his clenched jaw and furrowed brow betrayed the fact that he was just as uncomfortable as the rest of them. The two of them, Jack and Tessa, had been through so much in the past few days, but this place was different. This wasn't just another abandoned house. There was something oppressive about it, a dark energy that clung to the walls and made the air heavy with a sense of dread. Ethan glanced at the doorway where the woman had disappeared earlier. She hadn't returned, and the uncertainty of her absence only deepened the tension in the room. There was something about her, her coldness, her detachment, that unsettled him. She had led them in here, almost as if it were her duty to bring them to this very place, to this moment. But what was waiting for them here? And more importantly, why had she left them alone in this suffocating room? Are we really supposed to just sit here? Jack's voice broke the silence, the sharpness in his tone betraying his own frustration and anxiety. I mean, what is this place? What are we even supposed to be looking for? Ethan looked at Jack, his own frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. He didn't have an answer. The truth was, he didn't know what they were looking for. But something was pulling them here, like a magnetic force they couldn't escape. And now that they were here, the house seemed to have no intention of letting them leave until it had revealed whatever it was hiding. I don't know, Ethan said quietly, his voice betraying the growing unease in his chest. But I don't think waiting is going to help us. We've been waiting too long already. Tessa shifted uncomfortably on the couch, her eyes darting to the hallway again. The slight trembling of her hands didn't go unnoticed by Ethan. She was trying to remain calm, but her nervous energy was palpable. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but she closed them again, her brow furrowing as she struggled to collect her thoughts. Ethan could feel the tension between them, the unsaid words and the shared sense of fear that none of them could quite shake. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, faint at first, but growing louder, more deliberate. Ethan's breath hitched, his senses sharpened as he sat up straighter, every nerve in his body on high alert. The footsteps didn't belong to the woman, they were heavier, more purposeful. His pulse quickened, and for a split second, he wondered if he was imagining it. But no, there was something undeniably real about the sound, something that seemed to vibrate through the floor beneath them. Jack turned his head toward the hallway, his expression hardening, a flicker of recognition passing through his eyes. But there was no time to speak. The footsteps grew louder, almost as if they were deliberately drawn closer to them, and then the door creaked open. The woman appeared, her silhouette framed by the dim light from the hallway. She stepped into the room, and the atmosphere shifted in an instant, almost as if the house itself had exhaled. She wasn't alone. Behind her, a tall man emerged, his figure imposing, his dark eyes scanning the room with an unsettling calmness. The air in the room seemed to thicken, and Ethan felt his throat tighten as if the man's presence alone was enough to suffocate him. There was a quiet, lingering moment where the man didn't speak, just standing there with an almost predatory stillness, as if waiting for something. The woman's voice broke through the tension, low and authoritative. "Sit. All of you." Her gaze flickered briefly to the couch, and despite the order in her tone, Ethan felt an undeniable chill at the command. Without thinking, they all obeyed. It was as if the weight of her presence had drained them of the will to do anything but comply. The man's eyes lingered on them, his silence adding to the growing sense of dread. Ethan couldn't take his eyes off the man. His posture, his presence, there was something unnervingly familiar about him. But Ethan couldn't place it. He felt like he should know him, like they had crossed paths before, but the thought remained elusive, hanging in the back of his mind like a forgotten dream. Finally, the man spoke. His voice was deep, smooth, and laced with an ominous weight. "Are you all here to find answers?" His words sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "Because you won't find what you're looking for here. Not in the way you think." The coldness in his tone was unmistakable, and the words left an indelible mark on Ethan. Was this some kind of warning? Or was it a declaration of the inevitable truth that they were walking into a trap from which there was no escape? Ethan tried to steady his breathing, but his heart hammered in his chest. His mind raced as the man's gaze met his, their eyes locking in a moment that felt far too loaded, as though the space between them held 1,000 unspoken questions. But the man's face remained impassive, unreadable. "I'm not sure what we're looking for," Ethan replied quietly, his voice betraying his growing unease. "But we're here. And we don't have anywhere else to go." The man's lips twitched into the slightest of smiles, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Then you'll regret that decision," he said, his voice dropping low. "But it's too late now." Ethan's stomach dropped. The man's words hung in the air, suffocating him, and he knew in that moment that whatever happened next, there was no turning back. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like it was pressing against their skin, suffocating them with every breath they took. Ethan could feel his heart racing, the rapid thumping almost drowning out the other sounds, the creak of the wooden floorboards beneath his feet, the soft crackling of the fire in the hearth, and the faint hum of the house, which seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The man stood there, an immovable figure in the center of the room, his eyes gleaming with a chilling intensity that made Ethan's stomach churn. Every inch of his body screamed for him to move, to escape, but he couldn't. He was rooted to the spot, locked in some invisible vice that had taken hold of him the moment they had walked into this place. Jack, too, stood motionless beside him, but Ethan could see the muscles in his jaw clenching, his fists balled at his sides as if he were trying to contain the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Ethan's eyes flicked briefly to Tessa, who was sitting slightly behind him, her face pale and drawn. Her lips were pressed tightly together, and her eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief, rarely left the man standing across from them. He could see her fingers trembling in her lap, though she was doing her best to hide it, but Ethan knew the fear that was tightening around her chest was as real as his own. The man broke the silence, his voice low and deliberate, each word hanging heavily in the air like smoke from a slow-burning fire. "You think you've come here for answers," he said, his gaze cutting across them with a sharpness that made Ethan flinch inwardly. "But this place, this house," he paused for a beat, his eyes narrowing as if he was savoring the impact of each syllable. "This place holds far more than you could ever imagine. And none of you are prepared for what you'll uncover." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The man's words felt like ice pouring through his veins, freezing him in place. What was he talking about? Ethan couldn't wrap his mind around it. This was supposed to be about finding the truth about what happened to their families, what had been hidden for so long. But what truth was he speaking of? His thoughts whirled in frantic circles as the weight of the man's cryptic words pressed down on him, making it harder to breathe. The room felt colder now, even though the fire burned brightly. Ethan glanced at the fireplace, noticing that the flames danced more erratically, casting flickering shadows that stretched long and menacing along the walls. It felt as though the house itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them to make the wrong move. Tessa's voice broke through the fog of unease in Ethan's mind, though it was barely above a whisper. "What do you mean? What is this place?" Her words were tight, strained, as if she were grappling with a sense of helplessness that she couldn't quite shake off. Her eyes flickered toward Ethan, searching for something, some reassurance, but all he could offer was a helpless shake of his head. He didn't have any answers. Not yet. The man's lips curled slightly, but it wasn't a smile, it was something darker, more like the smirk of a predator who knew something the prey didn't. "What do I mean?" he repeated, letting the words settle in the air before speaking again, slower this time, drawing out each word with a chilling deliberation. "I mean that the truth you think you're seeking," his eyes briefly flicked toward Jack, who was standing closest to him, "the truth you think will set you free, will trap you." Ethan's stomach churned. The man's words twisted in his mind like a knife turning, and he could feel the fear creeping up his spine again. He had the sudden, overwhelming feeling that they had stepped into something much darker than they had anticipated. Something that wasn't just about finding the truth, it was about confronting something deeper, something far more sinister that had been buried for years. Jack took a step forward, his face hardening into an expression of defiance, but Ethan could sense the uncertainty simmering just beneath the surface. "Who are you?" Jack demanded, his voice cracking slightly, betraying the fear that was clawing at him. "What do you want from us?" The man didn't flinch, didn't even blink. His gaze remained fixed on Jack, as though he were studying him, weighing him like an insect under a magnifying glass. "Who I am is not important," he said with a casual shrug, as though the answer didn't matter at all. "What matters is what I've seen. What I know." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. The man was playing games with them, but there was no mistaking the gravity in his words. What did he know? What had he seen? Tessa shifted beside him, her voice coming out more forcefully this time. "What is it that you know?" she asked, trying to sound confident, but Ethan could hear the tremor beneath her words. She was scared, terrified, just like the rest of them. But she was trying, desperately, to keep it together, to push through the fear and face whatever was coming head-on. She wasn't going to let this man control the conversation, but Ethan wasn't sure they had a choice. The man looked at her then, his gaze softening just a fraction, though it still held the same coldness. "What I know," he repeated, the words drawing out with a slow, deliberate cadence, "is that none of you are ready for what you're about to uncover. The truth isn't something you can handle. Not in this house." His eyes flickered to the woman standing next to him, whose face remained impassive and unreadable. She hadn't said a word, but Ethan could feel her presence like a weight in the room, the silence between them all thickening, as if she were waiting for something. Ethan's chest tightened as he looked between them. Whatever was happening here, it was far beyond anything he had imagined when they set foot in this house. And then, as if the very air had turned against them, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, making them all jump in shock. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The sound reverberated through the house like a gunshot, and in that moment, he knew for certain, that there was no going back. They were trapped, in more ways than one. The man stepped forward, his movements smooth and almost predatory. His eyes locked on Ethan's, and his voice dropped lower, filled with finality. "Once you cross the threshold, there is no turning back," he said. "Once you step into the dark, you may never come out." Ethan's breath caught in his throat, and for the first time, he felt an overwhelming urge to run. But he couldn't. The truth was here. It had been waiting for them all along. And now, they were in it, caught in the web, with no way to escape. The silence in the room hung heavy, suffocating all of them with an unseen weight, making it impossible to breathe properly. Ethan's heartbeat quickened, echoing loudly in his ears. Every passing second seemed to stretch into infinity, each one pressing harder against his chest. His thoughts spun wildly, but there was a sharp, gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach, fear, yes, but also something darker, something that whispered, "This isn't just a threat, this is real." He could feel the adrenaline rising, but it was mixed with an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they had unwittingly crossed into a place they didn't belong. His body stiffened as his mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The words the man had spoken, cryptic, cold, calculated, still hung in the air, each syllable sinking deeper into the core of their unsettling reality. Beside him, Jack shifted his weight, his body taut with tension, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Jack was never one to back down from a challenge, never one to flinch in the face of danger, but now, Ethan could see the hesitation in his movements, the tightness around his jaw. It wasn't just a simple fear. It was the kind of fear that told them they had wandered too far into a game where the rules no longer applied. Jack stepped forward anyway, his voice firm, but with a trace of something raw, almost desperate. "We didn't come here to play games," Jack said, his voice stronger now, though it shook with the tension beneath it. "You want to threaten us? Fine. But don't think you can scare us away. We're here for answers. Give us the truth, now." The man's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable, as if Jack's words didn't faze him in the slightest. He stood completely still, his hands folded calmly in front of him, exuding an aura of control that made Ethan's skin crawl. There was no rush in his demeanor, no sign of urgency, just a calm, menacing certainty. A certainty that, no matter how brave they tried to appear, he held all the cards. The woman standing beside him remained silent, an immovable figure, her face impassive, her eyes distant as if she wasn't even part of the conversation. Her stillness unsettled Ethan in ways he couldn't explain. She wasn't even looking at them, but her presence seemed to amplify the tension, her silence loud enough to drown out their every word. Tessa, still gripping Ethan's arm, her knuckles pale from the pressure, finally spoke. Her voice was small, fragile even, yet it cut through the silence like a knife. "Please, just tell us. We need to understand what happened," she said, her eyes wide and searching, like a child lost in a maze with no way out. Ethan could see the vulnerability in her face, the flicker of hope that they could still get the answers they sought, that there was still a chance to make sense of everything. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying the fear she tried so hard to hide. For a brief moment, the man's gaze softened, just enough for Ethan to catch it, a fleeting, almost imperceptible shift. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced once more by that cold, calculating stare. He leaned slightly forward, his voice dropping into a quiet whisper, like a secret shared between old enemies. "The truth you seek," he said, each word slow and deliberate, "comes at a price. And not just any price, your price." Ethan froze, the weight of the man's words settling into him with a cold, sinking feeling. What did he mean by that? What could he possibly be referring to? The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing in on them from all sides, and Ethan felt the temperature drop, the chill crawling under his skin. His thoughts began to slow, his mind unable to process the gravity of the situation fast enough. This was no longer about getting answers, it was about survival. Jack, seemingly undeterred, took another step forward, but Ethan could sense the shift in his posture. The defiance was still there, but it was tinged with doubt now. What's the real cost? What's the catch here? You think we'll just walk away from this after everything we've been through? If you know something, just say it. His words, though spoken with bravado, rang hollow to Ethan's ears. There was an edge of panic creeping in, a desperation to maintain control in the face of something they didn't understand. The man remained unmoved, his gaze fixed on Jack with a chilling calmness, almost amused. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering the request. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low, laden with ominous weight. You think you want the truth. But I promise you, once you take that step, once you see what lies beneath all of this, you won't be able to turn back. The things you will learn will unravel you. They'll tear apart everything you thought you knew about yourselves. And when it's all over, you'll be left with nothing but shadows. The words hung in the air like a looming storm, the tension rising with every syllable. Ethan could feel his pulse racing, his breath quickening, as the realization began to dawn on him. They were standing on the edge of something far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. The truth wasn't just a piece of information, it was a force, something capable of breaking them down, of shattering everything they had worked for. And yet, despite the fear gnawing at his insides, Ethan knew they couldn't walk away now. They were too far in. Tessa, still pale, stepped back slightly, her expression hardening as if she were trying to steel herself against the inevitable. What do we have to do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The vulnerability that had marked her earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. She had made up her mind. The truth, whatever it was worth the cost, no matter what that price was. The man's smile returned, slow and deliberate, as he looked at each of them in turn. The price, he repeated, savoring the words. It's not something you'll be able to pay easily. But if you insist on knowing, well, then you'll find out soon enough. The finality of his statement was chilling. Ethan could feel the weight of his words pressing down on him, the knowledge that there was no turning back now. The darkness was waiting for them, and they had no choice but to step forward into it, whether they were ready or not. The room felt colder still, and Ethan could feel the panic rising in his chest. But even as fear took hold, another part of him, the part that had always driven him to push forward no matter the odds, was determined. They had come for answers. And answers, no matter how terrifying, were what they would get. Linda Carter's name never made it to the news. But in that diner, during those long, frozen hours, she reminded everyone that true heroism doesn't come with medals or headlines. It comes quietly, in the form of courage, compassion, and one person's refusal to look away. Because sometimes, all it takes to save a dozen lives is one open door.